Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and I've been applying the Paradigm for Peace model to the current crisis in Ukraine. And this is part of my grand finale of 5 videos, which I'm cutting to the chase and showing you the entire framework of the model applied to the crisis. So we talked about the first of the 4 elements of the model. The first element was the roots of violence, and the past 2 videos were about the defensive and aggressive roots of violence, which you look at on both sides of conflict. You don't, instead of just looking at, oh, the U.S.'s defensive roots of violence and Russia's aggressive roots of violence, you look at both, defensive and aggressive here, defensive and aggressive there. That's how you look at things impartially, with what I call the wise ego. So in this video, we'll look at escalators of violence. Escalators of violence are those factors which make it more likely a person will choose violence in response to their defensive fears or their aggressive desires. So let me set the timer. I don't have a written script for this grand finale. I'm using these charts that I made, and what I'll do is I'll type up a transcript or a rough transcript of what I'm talking about and then send that to countercurrents.org, and hopefully they can post it, because they've been posting all my essays. So I'm going to set a timer to make sure I don't talk too long so that the camera doesn't shut off. So there are 3 escalators of violence in my model, Paradigm for Peace. Mental escalators of violence, legal escalators of violence, and physical escalators of violence. And I know you can't see this very well, but I'll type it up and I'll talk about it. These are mental escalators of violence. This is actually probably one of my favorite topics to talk about in the whole model, and it's a very neglected topic. The very first mental escalator, there's like 100 mental escalators of violence, which are conditions of the heart and the mind that make it more likely that you won't be able to care for somebody or understand them, or that you won't know the truth of a situation. So, a very big thing that blocks our access to truth is U.S. propaganda. And that's one of the top things I have down here, U.S. propaganda. It's sickening. Now, as I've told many people, we don't always know what's true and false. I can't read something in the newspaper and always say, oh, that's true, that's false. And I'm not going to tell you that if I don't know for sure. But there are some things you can tell for sure. Like when the New York Times or Reuters or the New York Post says that Putin has said this in the February 21st speech, or Putin wrote this in his July 2021 essay. Then you read that essay, you read that speech, and he didn't say it. And you see how they made it up, or they twisted it so badly. You see, that is false. That's libel. I mean, they should be sued. And that's happening so much that I don't put 1 ounce of trust in anything I read about this conflict put out by the U.S. propaganda, by the mainstream media. I don't trust anything, because it is so bad what they write. So U.S. propaganda is a bad thing. Now, most of my essays, the whole part 4, has been about U.S. propaganda. See, I started on the YouTube channel, the first several essays were about the propaganda, the cultural script, where you have this good guy rescuing this victim, you know, a hero rescuing a victim, an innocent victim, from the bad, evil persecutor, Russia. And I wrote about how this whole drama, which is false, is being portrayed to be true by media and policy makers. And they do this by just talking about the good stuff that the good guy's doing, that the hero's doing. They hide any greed amongst U.S. policymakers and aggression. They hide any greed and aggression in the victim or any violence. And then any fears that Russia has that may be motivating it, they trivialize it, laugh at it, distort it, or don't even mention it. Because if Russia's not motivated by fear to attack, it must be motivated by evil and malice. So that's how they do it. So those are the first several essays that I wrote. Then I started applying the Paradigm for Peace model, And we talked about the first category, the first root of violence, threats to life and safety. And I kind of went through that methodically. Then for the category power and freedom, I didn't go through it methodically with you, but I posted some essays showing some aggressive behaviors in U.S. government, the coups, CIA behavior, National Endowment for Democracy behavior. But then at that point, I stopped going through the roots of violence temporarily because the propaganda was so bad and so thick. So I thought, I've got to address this. So that was part 4, and there were like 21 or so essays on that propaganda, and I was going to keep going there because you got to see how all this propaganda is twisting things. But at this point, things are so dangerous that now I'm just cutting to the chase and showing you how to apply the entire model in a nice overview to the conflict so that you can see how to do it, and hopefully you can tell others and tell policymakers, tell media makers that there's another way to handle this conflict. Okay? So, what I'm talking about now is U.S. propaganda. Let me give you an example, because a lot of my essays were about the propaganda. This is a letter to the New York Times that I wrote, which of course they didn't accept. But please listen. I wrote this in August. Roger Cohen's Odessa is Defiant, August 21st, irresponsibly drips with unsubstantiated, fashionable assertions and twists half-truths to a slanderous degree. Cohen refers derogatorily to Putin's February 21st, 2022 speech as displaying particular venom for Odessa and his intention to capture criminals. He implies, Cohen implies, that a hateful Putin is ludicrously obsessed with Odessa and seeks to punish imaginary neo-Nazis. Has Cohen no compassion for anti-Kiev protesters killed in Odessa on May 2nd, 2014? It is this atrocity to which Putin refers in his speech. Cohen falsely asserts that Putin promotes authoritarianism, imperialism, and barbarism, while Ukraine promotes a democratic future, diversity, and culture. And I should have put in quotes the authoritarianism, imperialism, and barbarism, he says Putin promotes. Cohen utters the incessantly parroted lie that Putin denies Ukraine's statehood. Seeking to link Putin with anti-Semitism, Cohen describes a 1905 Russian anti-Jewish pogrom. He denies recognition of the pro-Kiev neo-Nazi and ultranationalist violence against Jews, Russians, feminists, and gays documented by human rights groups. And Romani, I should have written in there. Why no mention of U.S. avarice for Black Sea fossil fuels and Europe's energy market? Why ignore the U.S.-sponsored 2014 coup in Ukraine? Why the assumption that pro-Russians are malicious liars, while those supporting the U.S., NATO, and Kiev are noble truth-tellers? Why this unsophisticated good versus evil script? NYT reporters must aim higher than one-sided, deceptive reporting that fosters ignorance and hostility. And it angered very much because this article, as I said, Cohen says that Putin displayed particular venom for Odessa, like that's the place he really hates and he's going to go get them, and how he singled out Odessa in his February 21st speech as a place he's going to go get. But this is what this is what Putin says about Odessa in his February 21 speech. Here are Putin's actual words. Quote, "One shudders at the memories of the terrible tragedy in Odessa, where peaceful protesters were brutally murdered, burned alive in the House of Trade Unions. The criminals who committed that atrocity have never been punished. No one is even looking for them. But we know their names and we will do everything to punish them, find them, and bring them to justice." That's why Putin mentioned Odessa, because he was distraught about what had happened to the people of Odessa, and that nothing was being done to find the criminals. But Cohen makes it sound like Putin really hates Odessa. And then, as I say, these ultranationalists, including neo-Nazis, attack Jewish Ukrainians, yet Cohen actually he sort of tries to link Putin with anti-Semitism. He doesn't blatantly say it, but he does this subtle kind of link with a pogrom by talking about this pogrom. It was just a horrendous article. And Roger Cohen's not the only one. Whenever I look at the New York Times, they're doing this. With their special reports, you know, these lengthy articles that make you think, oh, I'm really getting a grip on what's happening. You're not. It reminds me of the Persian Gulf War. They did a survey and they found that people who watched the news about the Persian Gulf War knew less about what was happening in the Persian Gulf War than people who didn't watch the news. So the New York Times, frankly, I think it would be better if the New York Times had never existed. They are really pushing for this war because they're pushing hate Putin, hate Russia, especially hate Putin, because I think U.S. policymakers want some kind of a coup so that they can take over. The New York Times is being totally irresponsible. So I see this propaganda as a huge mental escalator of violence. Other mental escalators of U.S. violence: blind convictions of own morality. And that happened throughout the Cold War too, where people like the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, CIA director. Stephen Kinzer writes about them in The Brothers. They really saw themselves as good people fighting evil, even with a missionary type of spirit. Woodrow Wilson saw himself as having this missionary spirit as he intervened in more nations than any president previous to him. So when these people think that they're on the side of good and God, that they're capable of doing such cruel things because their convictions of morality blind themselves to the cruelty of their actions. And they think so much that they're fighting evil that they think their cruelty against the evil is actually holy. But they don't see that the evil's not evil. That's the problem that's going on. Okay, other problems, other mental escalators of U.S. violence. Anti-Russian prejudice. It's huge. And the road was paved during the Cold War with all sorts of propaganda, which even George Kennan, the policymaker, he thought of Russia as Soviet Union as this terrible place. And then even he later realized he'd made a mistake, and that in their culture, the policymakers were like creating this image of this monster day in and day out. He wrote it somewhat like that. And there's anti-Russian prejudice in TV shows and movies. And then when we hear about, oh, Russia's invading Ukraine, it like feeds this prejudice from long ago that we've heard, or from recently that we've heard. And that's a huge mental escalator of violence. It's just terrible. And people who have the prejudice don't see it as prejudice. Like, they'll see prejudice against blacks as prejudice. Well, hopefully they do. They'll see prejudice against gays as prejudice. I hope they do. But they don't see prejudice against Russians as prejudice. And it is prejudice. Other mental escalators of U.S. violence: competition, rivalry, status, greed. It's in U.S. culture, and it's especially, I think, in the U.S. foreign policy making culture and the business culture, where they think we've got to go get those fossil fuels out of the Caspian Sea before that company does, or before Russia does, because then we're smart. We're worth it. Our status goes up. It's like a status thing. They want profits too. That's a big part of it. They want the money, because they associate the high numbers, maybe from school, I don't know what. High numbers mean you're great. So high amounts of money mean you're great. And they want the status. And I think within the cultures, you know, they get pats on the back for making a deal, for winning out over some other company. But as I've said many times, it reminds me of how John D. Rockefeller and Morgan, you know, were rivals for the railroads across the West, trying to beat each other out and getting ownership of railroads. And they didn't see, they were blinded to what the railroads were doing to the bison, to the Native Americans, to the land. They were so consumed by the rivalry. Or as I mentioned, I think it was Deutsche Bank, at the start of World War II, when Germany was going to annex Austria, these banks were trying to beat each other to take over the Jewish-owned banks in Austria. And it wasn't so much that they were anti-Semitic, but they were rivalrous, and they were trying to beat each other. So this rivalry can blind people to the damage of the fossil fuels, to the damage of the wars to get the pipelines, to the damage of the coups to get the leader in power who will give you the pipelines. It's they're obsessed. So there's this huge problem that has to be addressed. And in many ways, you've got to address it in childhood and in adulthood, and you've got to have people going into these organizations and training them and treating them. It has to be addressed publicly, privately, and with compassion. Before I continue, I want to say the escalators of violence that I'm looking at are all escalators of U.S. violence. And I'm not trying to pick on the U.S., but I'm much more familiar with the escalators of U.S. violence. So that's why I'm writing about it. But somebody who's more familiar with escalators of Russian violence or Zelensky's violence or NATO's violence, they could do charts for that. Okay, so I'm not trying to pick on the U.S., but it's really important to look at escalators of U.S. violence, since the U.S. has the biggest military arsenal in the world and all this money that's using for war. Now, the next 5 mental escalators that I list are types of psychological patterns that I've mentioned in previous essays, so I'll just mention them briefly. George Lakoff's, what he calls the strict model of human relations, in which people believe that there should be a hierarchy of people, of nations, that the people on top should make the rules for the ones on the bottom. Authority is very important. Obedience is very important. Non-questioning obedience. Competition is important to prove moral worth. That type of model is not conducive to good international relations. It's really not conducive to good relations of any sort. It's not good in negotiations between nations, to think that when you're having a negotiation with Iraq or with Russia that there's a hierarchy, that Russia has to do what we say or Iraq has to do what we say. It should, the strict model is an escalator of violence. And George Lakoff describes this model. Gordon Allport's, what he describes as the prejudiced personality, which relates to the strict model. They tend to have the black and white thinking, where they see people as all good or all bad. So that lends itself to this cultural script of the hero rescuing the innocent victim against the evil persecutor. They tend to, the prejudiced personality seems to develop it from an atmosphere of an underlying threat, like threatened feelings. And it relates also to the next thing, Edward Sprenger's political lenses. He talks about 6 different lenses by which people can view life. And I talk about all these in Essay 4B. And Sprenger's talked about in Allport's book. With political lenses, people tend to view relationships as revolving around domination, superiority, and inferiority. Not about love, joy, friendship, having fun. Not about helping each other. It's all about who's top, who's bottom. And it reminds me so much of these U.S. policymakers who say, if we don't make the rules, they're going to make them for us. If we don't shape the world, they're going to shape it for us. They see things that way. And maybe they've had lives like that too. But it's that can really skew your foreign policy in a very bad way. I mean, yeah, you want to be watching out for potential threats, but if you don't want to be making up threats in your head. Like if NATO's saying, oh, if we don't go east, Russia's going to come west. Well, what if Russia wasn't going to come west? Frankly, I don't think it was. Then NATO keeps going east. Well, now Russia did invade Ukraine, which is what they were feeling. NATO's fearing all along an invasion, right? They pushed. They threatened Russia, so now Russia invades. It's called a negative Pygmalion. They had such low expectations of Russia that they made Russia into the nation that they always thought it was, which is bad, an invader, aggressor. Actually, Russia's not an aggressor. It's responding to a civil war. The next, negative traits of the parent and child egos, and the lack of a wise ego, lack of impartial analysis. And I talked about that. I talked about that in one of the Part 4 essays near the end, when I talked about transactional analysis. And in transactional analysis, they talk about how you want, they call it a mature, integrated adult ego. I call it a wise ego, where you can impartially analyze a problem, you take in information comprehensively and think objectively, and then you have positive features of the parent ego in you, positive features of the child ego in you, such as spontaneity of the child, nurturance of the parent. And you can see, I explain it more in another essay. It's in the book called Born to Win. But what I see happening with U.S. policymaking is that they don't show the wise ego at all. That's why we've got Biden sending weapons. And not just Biden, but every president before him. They've got, instead, they don't have the wise ego. They don't have the adult ego impartially analyzing events and comprehensively taking in information. They've got the negative traits of the parent ego, which is the prejudice and the punitiveness, and the negative traits of the child ego, which is the aggression, the self-indulgence, the self-centeredness, and the fearfulness. And those negative traits are what's driving U.S. foreign policy. That's why it's so mature. That's why people are going crazy thinking our U.S. leaders should never have even graduated from kindergarten. They're behaving terribly. It's not that they're behaving like children, because I think many children would behave much better than this. But they're behaving with the negative parts of the child ego and the negative parts of the parent ego. So those are the mental escalators of U.S. violence that I find are the most important ones, messing things up right now. There are other things too, like lack of skill in cooperative dialogue, lack of skill in integrative negotiation, which is a cooperative type of negotiation where you're trying to help both sides and you're caring and it's egalitarian. But let's move on now. Legal escalators of violence. And there it is, and I'll type it up. There are a lot of legal escalators of violence driving this conflict. And the first one is the fact that these dysfunctional psychological types are allowed to lead U.S. foreign policy. Like, why don't we have these types of people screened out more somehow in the campaign process? Why does the media just focus on trivial stuff? They should be focusing on these psychological patterns, and not just diversity. Is she black or white? Is it a woman or a man? What about the psychological patterns? That's really the meat of the matter. You know? The other stuff is just surface, really. Another huge legal escalator of U.S. violence is the failure to enforce international law. For example, U.S. supported 2014 coup in Ukraine. Why wasn't this even investigated? Why weren't there international hearings about this? The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Nobody could stop the U.S. There were no sanctions against the U.S. You know? Nobody could cut off loans to the U.S. U.S. extrajudicial drone attacks. So Obama, the lawyer, could just have this kill list every week where people have no lawyer, no trial, no jury, no judge. He's a lawyer, and he just says, kill them. So he decides it. He's jury, judge, you know. It's not just him, you know, it's continuing. This drone warfare, extrajudicial drone attacks. International law is not being enforced. And Putin condemned this fact in his Munich speech of 2007, which is what got him into trouble with the U.S. when the anti-Putin smear campaign began. He was complaining that international law wasn't being enforced. So they flipped it all and made it look like he was the bad guy. Lack of sound decision-making process and democratic control. over U.S. weapon shipments, proxy war, and war. We have no voice. Americans have no voice in any war, in any proxy war, or in any weapon shipments. We just have Biden saying, oh, I'm sending weapons. You know, when I write my representative, stop sending these weapons, I get a form letter back saying, be assured, we're sending weapons, we're sending billions in weapons. They don't listen, they don't ask, and they supposedly represent us. They don't. They're just a certain breed of people. They're in their own little world. There's no, and even in their world, there's no sound decision-making process. Capture of the U.S. foreign policy mission. This is a big one that I found from my 21 years of research, which is that when the Department of Defense, thinks of a military plan or wants to send weapons, or the CIA wants to do this or that, it's not that they're wrong because they're doing their missions. But their missions should not be driving U.S. foreign policy. Nor should the Department of State, because I looked at the Department of State's mission and all the missions of its little bureaus. The Department of State looks to me like it's just a non-violent form of the Department of Defense. It's like, promote U.S. values by doing this. Get people to like us by teaching them this. It's all about, again, impose us on people so that they like us. It's not about understanding others. It's not about serving others, caring about others. How can we help them? It's not about making real friends. That's why I think Dennis Kucinich was on track in many ways. And certainly when he suggested and proposed a U.S. Department of Peace. Because that's the mission that should be driving U.S. foreign policy. I mean, the defense mission, the CIA mission, I think is awful. I mean, it's good to have some spies, I suppose. It makes sense, right? But not in this way where they're intrusive and creating coups, or what Ned's doing with the unrest that they creating havoc and calling it democracy. So the missions should not be driving U.S. foreign policy. Otherwise you get people thinking, oh, we've got to waterboard this guy. There's going to be another 9/11. We've got to get this information out of him. That's the only way they think, because that's how their missions are. We've got to get the information. You know how you can get information? You can talk kindly to Iraqis and Russians. Say, hey, how can we help you? What do you like about U.S. foreign policy? What don't you like? What do you like about your leader? What can we do together to help? You can get lots of really good information that way, in a friendly way. So there's a capture of the U.S. foreign policy mission by a couple organizations, and there is a lack of U.S. Department of Peace. Undemocratic influence of lobbyists. Everybody knows this, but nothing's done about it. I guess because the lobbyists keep making their contributions, and then the lawmakers need the contributions to stay in power, so they don't vote against anything that would hurt the lobbyists. Like, nobody has the guts because they're all brought into power with the lobbyists. So, undemocratic influence of the weapon industry, of the fossil fuel and nuclear industries, and of the right-wing Ukrainian lobbyists. I've seen a few articles about this. It began during the Cold War, too, where not just right-wing, but extreme right-wing Ukrainians who have very negative views towards Russia or towards anything left-wing have been filling the ears of U.S. policymakers for decades. And right now I've read that they have had more lobbying contacts even than the Saudis. The Saudis are known for having a huge number of contacts. So they're just filling U.S. policymakers' ears. Why? Why is this allowed, that such a preponderance, an imbalanced proportion of lobbyists can shout out one message? It doesn't make sense. You don't make peace by just hearing one side of the story. And then lastly I have down here, connection of money to political power. And that's always been a big problem in the U.S. government, and nothing's done about it. Then we'll move on to physical escalators of violence. Existence of abominable, blasphemous weapons. Nuclear, chemical, biological, bombs, especially from aircraft, drones, high kill, fast kill, sloppy kill weapons. Now, the fight against nuclear weapons was strong in the 80s, but it's like nothing now. Why? Having nuclear weapons is totally irresponsible. I remember it was so ridiculous when Putin was saying something to the effect that nuclear weapons might even be used, something like that back in February. And U.S. policymakers were saying, oh, how irresponsible of him. So they think they're responsible for having 4,000 nukes and revitalizing the nuclear arsenal for trillions of dollars without any intention of ever using it because they think it's irresponsible to use it. Is that a responsible use of our money? And is it responsible to have 4,000 nukes, someone that could blow up at any moment or go off, you know? How responsible is that? That's ridiculous. I mean, I don't want them to use it, but it's also irresponsible to create them with the point of never using them. You should never use them. But how can they call themselves responsible? It's dumb. And they're the ones, of course, who provoked Putin. So, biological weapons, like the things PNAC was talking about, these biological weapons that could attack genotypes. They write about Project for a New American Century writes about that in its 2000 document, Rebuilding America's Defenses. Bombs, especially from aircraft. William Bloom wrote about that, the late William Bloom. And it was a great point. Why aren't these considered weapons of mass destruction? It's abominable having bombs dropping out of the sky. Like, where have the standards gone? Well, these aren't monsters we're killing, dangerous monsters. These are people. They don't deserve that. And then the drones. I've heard that the sound of the drone, I mean, it's terrifying. And you never know if it's going to come. And I wrote high kill, fast kill, sloppy kill. All these weapons. The machine gun. Even when the machine guns first came out, some people were thinking, oh my God, these are inhumane. And they are. Where have the standards gone? Anything, I mean, I don't like anything that kills anyway, but anything that kills that fast, how can you have the judgment to decide, okay, that person should be killed and that all those people should definitely be killed because they're dangerous and they're bad people? How can a fast kill weapon, how can you have time to think, to figure that out? Same with sloppy kill, or things that kill in the future, like landmines and nuclear weapons that destroy our DNA. Another physical escalator of violence. Sending weapons to escalate civil war and provoke Russian invasion. In Afghanistan in 1979, Ukraine in 2022. As I wrote in my very first essay, Zbigniew Brzezinski admitted back in 1998 that the U.S., that he and Carter deliberately provoked the USSR. They sent weapons to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan 6 months prior to the Russian invasion. And they knew it would provoke the Soviet Union to invade. And they liked that idea because they thought it would help bleed the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski wanted to help keep the Soviets away from his precious Poland, which apparently is what U.S. foreign policy was all about then and is all about now too. And they're doing it now. I mean, they sent these weapons throughout the Civil War without advertising it to Americans, and they provoked Russia. They didn't give nonviolence a chance. As I explained, in Afghanistan, the Civil War, part of it was that the Marxist government in power there, which was allied with the Soviet government, had redistributed land because it was totally lopsided. A tiny percentage of people had all the land, or almost all the land. So they were redistributing land, and they were also canceling debts that had interest rates like of 100% or something like that. But then some people were angry about that because they thought of that as robbery. You know, the U.S. could have used all the money that went into the weapons in the war to compensate the landlords that lost their land, to compensate the money lenders for the debts that were canceled. They could have helped even things out. But no, they wanted to use money to escalate the Civil War because they didn't care about Afghanistan. They didn't care. They wanted the Soviet Union to get involved. It's totally immoral and shameful. And lastly, lack of democratic control over weapon manufacturing, despite its use of public taxes and its public consequences, its very public consequences. And I think I wrote this, or something like it, under the legal escalators of violence, like lack of a sound decision-making process and democratic control. Again, with the model paradigm for peace, sometimes there's overlap in between categories. You know, and you might have to think, do I want to put it in this category or that, or it really could belong in either one. But there's no need to argue about it. The point of the categories is just to make sure we don't forget anything. That's all. It's not like, oh, if you don't put it in the right category, you're going to mess up something somehow. Same with aggressive and defensive. Sometimes it's hard to tell if it's an aggressive route or a defensive route of violence. Escalators and solutions might use mental tools, legal tools, or physical tools. Or sometimes it's hard to say whether it's precisely a legal tool or a mental tool. Okay? So there's a little bit of fuzz, a bit blur in between the borders, and that's nothing to worry about. But, so I have it under here under physical escalator, that a lack of democratic control over the weapon manufacturing. Why don't we have a say in the fact in these nuclear weapons being built and revitalized? Why not? They use our taxes. We should have a right to say, especially because the public consequences. I mean, our war are devastating. This is big stuff. It should not be just a decision made by people who get campaign contributions to vote a certain way that will help the weapon industry and the fossil fuel industry. The government, it's totally undemocratic, plutocratic, and immoral. And I really hope we can fix it, but it might be too late. You know? Things might be too late at this point. But I hope you can tell people about this video and these escalators of violence. I hope you can send it out to 10 people and ask them to send it out to 10 people, just in case it can help. Maybe they can piggyback their own ideas onto it, and or get ideas of how to get. I don't know how to get these ideas to policymakers or media makers, or even if you do, how would it change their minds? I don't know. Or how can we meet with people from Russia and Ukraine? Can we somehow solve things without the government? But they'll keep sending their weapons, so I don't know what the solution is, but I hope somehow that the little presentation I gave here can give you some ideas on what to do. So thank you very, very much for listening. And the next video I'll do tomorrow, it will be on the 3 facets of solutions. I have them penciled in here. I got to put them in marker. And then the final video, the 5th video, I'll show you all the charts together. Not that you can read them well from there, but just so you can see the organization, because the organization helps you, I think, get a handle on things and realize, okay, we need to work on this and this and this and this. We can figure things out. Well, thanks a whole lot. Thanks for listening, and thank you again for those of you who have commented. It really, really makes my day when I get a comment from you guys. So thank you, and I wish you all the best. And I hope you're not having too many nightmares about World War III. I dreamed last night about it, and that we were dealing with a water shortage. There was no bottled water, and no water in the sinks, no bottled water, nothing, because of the conflict. Alright, well, take care now. Thank you. Good night.